There is a saying in the world I come from: the jungle doesn't announce the presence of a predator. You don't hear a roar, you feel it. A subtle shift in the air, a sudden silence where there was once noise, the instinctual prickle on the back of your neck that tells you something is watching, waiting. For 40 years, I built my company, Sterling Innovations, in that jungle. I faced down corporate raiders, navigated market crashes, and outmaneuvered men who saw me as nothing more than a temporary novelty. I learned to trust that instinct above all else. And for the past 3 months, my instincts have been screaming. The predator, I have come to realize with a heart colder than I thought possible, is my own son. If you are listening to this, and you have ever built something with your own 2 hands, only to see someone you love try to take it away, please subscribe and let me know. This is not a story about a mother's heartbreak. It is a story about a CEO's strategy. A story that begins with the scent of betrayal and ends with the satisfying click of handcuffs. My son Daniel is 42 years old and has never in his entire life wanted for anything. He is a product of my success. A man who wears a $2,000 suit but has never understood the value of a dollar earned through sweat. He is the chief operating officer of my company, a title he holds not through merit, but through birthright. He sees himself as a visionary, the rightful heir who is being held back by a founder who is past her prime. A dinosaur, as I once overheard him telling his wife, who doesn't understand the new world. He is arrogant, he is impatient, and he is, I have recently discovered, a fool. The first red flag appeared on a Tuesday, during our quarterly board meeting. I was presenting the latest profit and loss statements, my mind sharp, my numbers precise. Daniel, who usually sat through these meetings with a look of bored tolerance, suddenly leaned forward. "Mother," he interrupted, a thing he rarely dared to do. "I was reviewing the corporate bylaws last night, a fascinating read." A few of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Daniel was not known for his love of legal documents. I was particularly interested in Article 7, Section B, the incapacity clause. It seems vague. I held his gaze across the polished mahogany table. The incapacity clause was a standard piece of corporate boilerplate. It outlined the process for a transfer of power should the CEO become mentally or physically incapable of performing their duties. It had been written by our lawyers 30 years ago and hadn't been looked at since. "In what way do you find it vague, Daniel?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "Well," he said, leaning back with a practiced, casual air, "it just seems to rely heavily on a doctor's testimony. It doesn't account for a more gradual decline, a loss of sharpness. It seems a successor should be empowered to act preemptively, for the good of the company, of course." The implication was as subtle as a sledgehammer. He wasn't just asking a question, he was testing the waters. He was checking the locks on the cage he was planning to build for me. I saw the other board members exchange quick, nervous glances. I gave him a serene, untroubled smile. "An interesting point, Daniel. Perhaps you could have legal draft a memo on it for our next meeting." I then moved on without missing a beat, leaving him momentarily off balance. I showed no weakness, no anger, but I had seen his move, I had placed it on the board, and I had filed it away. The second red flag appeared a week later. I keep my office meticulously organized. Every file has a place. I am particularly fastidious about the quarterly covenants report, a sensitive document that details all the loan agreements and lines of credit that keep the company liquid. It is not a document I leave lying around. I keep the single hard copy in the top right-hand drawer of my desk, which I lock every evening. On a Thursday morning, I went to retrieve it to cross-reference a number. I unlocked the drawer. The document was gone. I felt a jolt, a surge of pure adrenaline. I searched the entire drawer, then the entire desk. Nothing. I did not panic. I did not call security. I simply sat back in my chair, the silence of my office pressing in on me, and I connected the dots, the vague questions about my mental decline, the sudden disappearance of a key financial document that would be essential in any hostile takeover attempt. My son was not just planning a coup, he was actively gathering his arsenal. The final, and most damning, piece of evidence came that very evening. I was working late, a habit I have never been able to break. The cleaning crew had already come and gone. The building was silent. I was walking past Daniel's office on my way to the elevator when I heard the low murmur of his voice. He was on the phone, his door slightly ajar. I knew I shouldn't listen. But my instincts, honed by 40 years in the jungle, screamed at me to stop. It was his wife, Sophie, on the other end. I could only hear Daniel's side of the conversation, but it was more than enough. "No, she hasn't said a thing," he was whispering, his voice a low, conspiratorial hiss. "I told you, she's losing her touch. The old dinosaur has no idea." There was a pause. "Sophie, it's all under control," he said, his voice laced with impatience. "I have the covenants report. The lawyers are drafting the final transfer documents now. All I need is her signature. Look, she's been forgetting things for months. She complains about her hand cramping up. It won't be difficult to help her sign it." He was going to forge my signature. He was going to use a lie about my declining health as his excuse, and then use a forged document to steal my life's work. I stood there in the silent, darkened hallway, the cool marble floor beneath my feet, and I felt the last vestiges of a mother's love for her son freeze into something cold, hard, and sharp. The heartbreak was a physical thing, a crushing weight in my chest, but on top of it something else was rising, a cold, calculating, and utterly focused rage. I could have confronted him. I could have burst into that office, fired him on the spot, and thrown him out of the building. But I knew my son. He would deny everything. He would paint me as the hysterical, paranoid old woman he was already claiming I was. It would be my word against his. It would be messy. It would be ugly. And as I stood there, a lifetime of strategic thinking took over. There is a famous quote, often misattributed to Napoleon: "Never interrupt your enemy when he is in the middle of making a mistake." Daniel thought I was a dinosaur. He thought I was weak, senile, and past my prime. He thought I was prey, and in that moment I decided to give him the performance of a lifetime. I would be the frailest, most confused dinosaur he had ever seen. I would let him walk right into the center of the beautiful, intricate, and utterly inescapable trap he was building for himself. But I would not do it alone. I turned away from his office door, my footsteps silent. I walked back to my own office, closed the door, and sat down behind my desk. I did not call my security chief. I did not call my board of directors. I picked up my personal cell phone, the one Daniel didn't know about, and I dialed a number that was not in my contacts list. It was a number I had been given years ago by an old friend in the Justice Department, a number to be used only in the most extreme of circumstances. A calm, professional voice answered on the second ring. "White Collar Crime Division. Agent Davies speaking." "Agent Davies," I said, my voice as cool and steady as the ice that had formed in my veins. "My name is Catherine Sterling. I'd like to report a crime, a very big one, and I'm going to need your help to set the trap." The first meeting with Agent Davies took place not in a sterile FBI office, but in a quiet, anonymous corner of the city's Botanical Garden Conservatory. It was my choice. I wanted to be surrounded by life, by the patient, silent growth of the orchids, as I planned the symbolic death of my relationship with my son. Agent Sarah Davies was not what I had expected. She was young, perhaps in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and a calm, no-nonsense demeanor that I immediately respected. She did not treat me like a hysterical old woman. She treated me like a source, a client. We sat on a wrought iron bench, the humid air thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming flowers. I laid out the story, from Daniel's vague questions about the incapacity clause to the conversation I had overheard. I spoke without emotion, presenting the facts as I would in a boardroom, a string of data points that led to an irrefutable conclusion. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When I was finished, she was silent for a long moment, her sharp gaze fixed on a rare black orchid blooming nearby. "It's a classic play, Mrs. Sterling," she said finally, her voice crisp and professional. "The heir apparent gets impatient. We see it all the time, but it's one of the hardest things to prove. Forgery, especially a good one, can be difficult to contest without a clear chain of evidence. It becomes a messy, he said, she said, battle in civil court. I am not interested in a civil court battle, Agent Davies. I said, my voice as cool as the iron bench beneath me. I am interested in justice. I am interested in a man who is about to commit a federal crime being held accountable for his actions in a way that he cannot spin, deny, or escape. I am interested in justice. A flicker of something admiration perhaps crossed her face. And how do you propose we do that? By letting him do it, I said. By helping him do it, by handing him the loaded gun and a signed confession, metaphorically speaking. You told me you need a clear chain of evidence. I intend to provide you with one. And so, in the quiet, humid sanctuary of the Orchid House, the plan was born. It was a dangerous, high-stakes performance, and I would be the lead actress. Agent Davies and her team would be my silent audience, recording everything, waiting in the wings for their cue. The FBI's technical team, she explained, was the best in the world. They could place listening devices so small, so discreet, they were virtually undetectable. They would bug my office, my conference room, and even the pen I used on my desk. Every conversation, every whisper, would become a piece of evidence. The key, Agent Davies explained, will be catching him in the act of the forgery itself, or, failing that, getting him to admit to it afterwards. We need him to incriminate himself. We will need you to guide him, to create the perfect, irresistible opportunity. Agent Davies, I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my lips. My son's greatest weakness is his belief in his own genius. Creating an opportunity for him to prove it will be the easiest part of this entire affair. The very next day, the performance began. I started small. I arrived at the office a little late. I misplaced my reading glasses during a meeting, forcing Daniel to read a report aloud to me. I let a conversation drift, appearing to lose my train of thought, only to have my son jump in and save me, finishing my sentence with a smug, knowing look at his fellow executives. They all saw what he wanted them to see, the brilliant founder, finally, inevitably, fading. The listening devices were installed over a weekend, a silent, invisible web laid throughout my corporate domain. The most ingenious of all was the pen. It sat in the holder on my desk, an elegant black fountain pen, indistinguishable from the one I had used for 20 years. But this one had a microphone with a 1,000-foot range and a pinhole camera in the clip. It would be the star witness to the crime. I began to set the stage for the main event. I started complaining of pains in my right hand, my signing hand. I would flex my fingers during meetings, wincing slightly. Arthritis, I suppose. I'd sigh to my secretary, loud enough for Daniel to overhear. Some days, I can barely hold a pen. It was a cruel, calculated lie, but I felt no remorse. The woman they were conspiring against, the weak, forgetful, ailing matriarch, she didn't exist. She was a ghost I had created, a fiction designed to lull a predator into a false sense of security. The bait was finally laid a week later. I called a senior management meeting to discuss the company's 5-year strategic plan. It was a subject I was passionate about, and I would normally have dominated the meeting. This time I was deliberately vague, unfocused. I presented a slideshow with 2 slides out of order. I confused a projection from 2025 with one from 2026. Daniel was in his element. He corrected me gently, patiently, his tone dripping with condescending respect. "I think you mean the 3rd quarter, Mother," he'd say. Or, "Perhaps we should revisit that projection after we've had a chance to rest." He was playing the part of the devoted, brilliant son, protecting his fading mother from her own decline, and the entire room was buying it. At the end of the meeting, I gave a heavy, world-weary sigh. "You know," I said to the room at large, "Daniel is right. I've been thinking a lot lately. Perhaps it's time for me to take a step back, a long vacation, maybe even retirement. It's time for a new generation of leadership." The silence in the room was electric. I could see the jolt of pure, unadulterated triumph in my son's eyes. He had been waiting his entire life to hear those words. He had thought he would have to take the kingdom by force, and here I was, seemingly ready to hand him the crown. He recovered quickly, his face a mask of loving concern. "Mother, you don't have to decide anything right now," he said smoothly. "You've earned your rest, more than anyone, but the company will always need your wisdom. It was a perfect performance, but my hidden microphone and my own 2 ears heard the lie. I had dangled the bait. I knew with absolute certainty that he would now move to close the trap. The tired old dinosaur had just announced she was ready to go extinct, and the predator would not be able to resist the urge to hasten the process. For the next 2 weeks, I lived a life of dual realities. In one reality, the one my son and the rest of the world saw, I was a woman in graceful decline. I became a master of the subtle art of feigned vulnerability. I would ask Daniel to repeat things in meetings, claiming my hearing wasn't what it used to be. I would leave a word hanging in the middle of a sentence, a look of faint, frustrated confusion on my face, waiting for him to supply it for me. I was weaving a tapestry of incompetence, thread by careful, deliberate thread, and Daniel, blinded by his own ambition, saw only the pattern he wanted to see. He saw a queen abdicating her throne. He never once thought to look for the dagger she was hiding in her robes. In my other reality, the one that existed in the locked study of my home and in encrypted calls with Agent Davies, I was more focused, more lethal than I had been in years. Every night, we would review the recordings from the day. We listened as Daniel consolidated his power, holding secret meetings with department heads, telling them of the smooth transition that was coming. We heard him on the phone with his wife Sophie, his voice dripping with arrogance. "She's practically senile," he'd crowed one evening, the recording crystal clear. "Today she asked me what the company's Q2 profits were. We just reviewed them yesterday. I'm telling you, Sophie, another month, and she'll be forgetting her own name. It's actually a mercy that we're stepping in. Just get the signature, darling." Sophie's voice purred back. "Then we can finally renovate the lake house. I'm so tired of that dreary 70s decor." Listening to them divvy up my life's work, my memories, like vultures circling a kill, was a uniquely painful form of torture. But I listened to every word. I absorbed every drop of their condescending poison. It was fuel. It kept my resolve as hard as diamond. The moment finally came on a Friday afternoon, the traditional graveyard of corporate decision-making. Daniel appeared in the doorway of my office, a thick, leather-bound document in his hand and a look of solemn, filial duty on his face. This was it, the moment the trap would be sprung. "Mother," he said, his voice soft, "I know you're tired, and I hate to bother you with this before the weekend, but the lawyers have finished drafting the corporate restructuring plan we discussed, the one that will ease your transition." He placed the document on my desk. It was a masterpiece of legal deception, I had to admit. Buried within 100 pages of routine corporate governance was the kill shot, a single, catastrophic paragraph that transferred all voting shares and executive authority to the chief operating officer himself, effective immediately upon signing. This was the performance of my life. I picked up the document. I squinted at the first page. "Oh, Daniel," I sighed, my voice a frail, weary thing. "So many pages. My eyes are just not up to this today. Can you tell me the gist of it?" "Of course, Mother," he said, pulling up a chair. He then proceeded to lie to my face with a smoothness that was almost hypnotic. He spoke of streamlining operations, of empowering junior executives, of protecting my legacy. He never once mentioned the transfer of power. He was selling me a beautiful empty box, knowing full well that a venomous snake was coiled at the bottom. I let him finish. Then, I picked up the pen. The FBI pen. The one that was, at that very moment, recording every detail of this monstrous betrayal in high-definition video and audio. "Well," I said, my hand trembling slightly, a tremor that was half acting, half genuine, bone-deep rage. "If you and the lawyers think it's for the best." I uncapped the pen. I poised the nib over the signature line. This was the moment. The FBI agents, I knew, were in a van across the street, watching a live feed, their hands likely hovering over the button to storm the building. But I couldn't let it be that easy. To simply catch him in the act of forgery would be one thing, but I wanted more. I wanted to give him the rope, all of it. I wanted to watch him build the gallows, tie the noose, and willingly, eagerly place it around his own neck. I let out a sharp, theatrical wince. I dropped the pen. "Oh my goodness," I gasped, flexing the fingers of my right hand. "This dreadful arthritis, it's acting up again. The cramps, I can barely hold it." Daniel's face was a mask of perfect, loving concern, but his eyes, for a split second, flickered with a raw, predatory impatience. He was so close, he could taste it. "Don't worry, Mom," he said, his voice a soothing purr. "There's no rush. We can do it on Monday." "Yes," I said, looking up at him, my eyes wide and trusting. "Monday would be better. I'll just leave this here on my desk and look it over this weekend. If I can. My head is just so foggy today." I had just handed him the crown jewels on a silver platter. I had established my physical inability to sign. I had established my mental confusion. And I had established that I was leaving the document, unsigned, in a place where he would have unrestricted access over the weekend. The look of relief on his face was so profound, it was almost comical. He had the perfect alibi. If anyone ever questioned the signature, he would simply say his poor, confused mother must have come in over the weekend and signed it during a moment of clarity, or perhaps had forgotten doing so entirely. "Of course, Mother," he said, standing up. "You just rest. You've earned it." He leaned down and kissed my forehead. The touch felt like a spider. As he walked towards the door, I played my final card. "Daniel?" I called out, my voice weak. He turned. "Yes, Mother." "I'm so proud of you," I whispered. You're ready. You're ready to lead this company. Your father would be so proud." It was the most profoundly dishonest thing I have ever said, and it was the final, perfect nail in his coffin. I saw his chest swell with a pride so immense, so absolute, it was sickening. He believed it. He believed in his own greatness. He believed in the lie of my decline. He smiled, a wide, genuine, triumphant smile. "Thank you, Mom," he said. "I won't let you down." Then he walked out, closing the door behind him, leaving me alone with the unsigned document and the silent, watching pen. I knew he would be back. Sometime over the long, quiet weekend when the building was empty, he would let himself into my office. He would sit in my chair, he would pick up my pen, and with a hand that had spent years practicing my signature, he would commit the crime that would end his life as he knew it. I did not feel sadness. I did not feel rage. As I sat there in the silent, gathering dusk, I felt only a profound, chilling, and absolute sense of victory. The trap was set. The bait was taken. And all I had to do now was wait for the snap. The 2 weeks that followed that Friday afternoon were a masterclass in psychological warfare. I, of course, did not return to the office on Monday. I called in sick, my voice a frail whisper on the phone, complaining of the arthritis in my hand and a general weary exhaustion. The document, I told my secretary, could wait. My health, for once, had to come first. This, I knew, would give Daniel the time he needed to file the forged paperwork and begin the process of seizing control. The official record would show that my signature was obtained on that Friday, and my subsequent absence would only serve to reinforce the narrative of my sudden decline. Agent Davies confirmed it 2 days later. "He did it," she said, her voice a flat, professional confirmation over our encrypted line. "He came in on Saturday morning. The pen's camera captured everything. It was a perfect forgery, I have to admit. He's had a lot of practice. We have it all, Catherine. He's ours. We can move in whenever you're ready." "No," I said, my voice calm. The trap had been sprung, but the hunt was not yet over. To arrest him now would be quiet, efficient. I did not want quiet. I wanted a reckoning. I wanted a lesson to be taught, not just to my son, but to the entire corporate world that had been watching, whispering, and waiting for me to fail. No, we wait. We let him think he has won. We let him call the meeting. And so, I waited. I stayed at home, playing the part of the convalescing founder. I ignored the increasingly frantic calls from my board members. I responded to Daniel's daily check-in calls with a vague, pleasant-sounding fatigue. He would tell me about the wonderful new initiatives he was implementing, the bold new direction he was taking the company in. He was a king, reporting his glorious victories to a dowager queen he had already exiled to a remote castle. He was so confident, so drunk on his own success, that he never once suspected the silence on the other end of the phone was not weakness, but the patient, coiled silence of a predator. The summons finally came, exactly as I knew it would, an official company-wide email sent from the desk of the Chief Operating Officer. An emergency board meeting was being called for the following Tuesday. The agenda was a single, ominous line, a discussion on the future leadership and strategic direction of Sterling Innovations. He wasn't just taking over, he was planning a public coronation. The morning of the meeting, I took my time getting ready. I did not choose a dress of mourning, nor a frail beige outfit befitting a retiree. I chose my armor. A sharply tailored blazer in a deep emerald green, the color of money and life. I wore my sharpest heels. My lipstick was a bold, defiant red. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I did not see a dinosaur. I saw a dragon, awake after a long, feigned slumber, and ready to breathe fire. I arrived at the company headquarters and walked into the boardroom 5 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to start. My entrance caused a ripple of shock and whispered speculation among the board members already gathered. They had been told I was ill, incapacitated, stepping down. Yet here I was, looking more powerful and vital than I had in years. I didn't take my usual seat at the head of the table. That was the throne Daniel now believed was his. Instead, I chose a simple chair in the front row, directly facing the podium, as if I were a mere spectator. I sat, crossed my legs, and waited. Daniel strode in at precisely 10 o'clock. He was radiating a confident, triumphant energy. He was followed by his wife, Sophie, who looked like a cat who had not just gotten the cream but the entire dairy. They saw me sitting there, and for a fleeting second, a flicker of surprise crossed Daniel's face, but it was quickly replaced by a look of condescending pity. He saw my presence not as a threat, but as a final, pathetic act of a defeated leader, coming to witness the formal transfer of her power. He walked to the head of the table, my husband's chair, my chair, and stood behind it, placing his hands on the back as if taking possession. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice smooth and commanding. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. As you know, there has been a great deal of speculation recently about the future of Sterling Innovations." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room, before they landed on me. "For 40 years, he said, his voice taking on a tone of deep, false reverence, this company has been guided by a single brilliant vision. My mother, Catherine Sterling, built an empire from nothing. She is a legend, and we all owe her a debt of gratitude that can never be repaid." The board members all turned to look at me, their faces a mixture of respect and sympathy. I simply held their gaze, my expression serene, my lips curved into the slightest, most enigmatic of smiles. "But time," Daniel continued with a heavy sigh, "moves on for all of us, and a wise leader knows when it is time to pass the torch. Over the past few weeks, my mother and I have had many long, emotional conversations. She has expressed her desire, and frankly, her need, to take a well-deserved retirement, to rest and enjoy the fruits of her incredible labor. It was a brilliant performance. He was painting a picture of a peaceful, loving transition, a decision made by me, for my own good. He was erasing the crime, whitewashing the forgery with a thick coat of filial piety. And while it is with a heavy heart that I accept this new responsibility," he said, his voice swelling with false humility, "it is with a clear vision for the future that I have agreed to step into the role of Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Innovations." He held up the forged document, which had been notarized and filed. "Per the transfer of authority signed by my mother 2 weeks ago, my leadership is effective immediately." A polite, slightly hesitant round of applause started around the room. The board, having been fed the narrative of my decline for weeks, was accepting the lie. They were accepting him. He had won. He looked directly at me, a final, triumphant, pitying smile on his face. He was waiting for me to nod, to cry, to give my silent blessing to his coup. I did not cry. I did not nod. I simply widened my own small, knowing smirk, and with my eyes, I glanced from his face to the grand, double doors at the back of the boardroom. A silent cue, the signal we had agreed upon. As Daniel opened his mouth to begin his first speech as the new CEO, the doors to the boardroom swung open with a quiet, authoritative force. And Agent Sarah Davies, flanked by 2 other FBI agents, all wearing dark official windbreakers, stepped into the room, The arrival of the FBI had a stunning, immediate effect on the room. The polite applause died instantly. The confident smiles on the faces of the board members froze, then melted into expressions of confusion and alarm. All the air, all the triumphant, self-congratulatory energy was sucked out of the room in a single, silent gasp. Daniel stood at the head of the table, his mouth still slightly agape, the first words of his victory speech dead on his lips. He stared at Agent Davies and her team, his mind, for the first time in his life, utterly unable to process what was happening. His perfectly constructed reality had just been shattered by an impossible intrusion. Sophie, his wife, let out a small, terrified squeak. She looked from the agents to me, and in her eyes I saw the first flicker of dawning, horrified comprehension. Agent Davies walked forward, her steps measured and confident. She did not address the board. She did not look at me. Her focus was entirely, and chillingly, on my son. "Daniel Sterling?" she said, her voice calm, professional, and amplified by the perfect acoustics of the room. "Yes?" Daniel stammered, his confident CEO persona crumbling into that of a startled, confused boy. "Who are you? What is this? This is a private board meeting." "I am Special Agent Davies of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," she said, holding up her badge. "And I'm afraid I have to interrupt." She took another step closer, and her agents fanned out, silent, professional presences that radiated pure authority. "Daniel Sterling, you are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud and corporate forgery." The words dropped into the silent room like stones into a deep, still pond. The board members stared, their faces a mask of collective shock. Forgery. Wire fraud. These were not words they were accustomed to hearing in their hallowed, mahogany-paneled boardroom. Daniel just stared at her, his face turning a pale, sickly shade of gray. "What? That's absurd," he managed to say, his voice a weak, reedy thing. "There must be some mistake. I am the new CEO of this company. My mother signed the transfer documents herself." He turned to me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading panic. "Mother, tell them you signed it. Tell them you wanted to retire." This was my cue. All the weeks of feigned weakness, of calculated silence, were for this single, perfect moment. I slowly, deliberately, rose from my chair. Every eye in the room was on me. I did not look at Daniel. I looked at the board, my colleagues, the men and women I had worked with for decades. "It is true," I said, my voice clear and strong, ringing with an authority they had not heard in months. "I did consider retirement. A leader must always consider the future. But a true leader must also protect the company from threats, both external and internal." I then turned my gaze to my son. I let the full weight of his betrayal and my profound, cold disappointment show on my face. "No, Daniel," I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "I did not sign that document, but I did watch you do it, on a very high-resolution camera, hidden in the pen you used to commit the crime." The last vestige of color drained from his face. He looked down at his hands as if they were alien things, the very hands that had so confidently traced my name. He finally understood. This wasn't a mistake. This was a checkmate. Sophie let out a small, choked sob and sank back into her chair. You set me up," Daniel whispered, his voice a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, horrified respect. "No, Daniel," I corrected him. "I did not set you up. I merely created an environment in which your own character could reveal itself. You built this trap yourself, with your own greed and your own arrogance. I just opened the door for you and let you walk in." I looked at Agent Davies and gave a small nod. That was her cue. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice now hard as steel, "please put your hands behind your back." As the agents moved forward, as the cold, metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the silent boardroom, I walked to the head of the table. I stood behind the chair, my chair. I placed my hands on its back, reclaiming my throne not with a forged signature, but with an unshakable, hard-won authority. Daniel, his face a mask of utter, pathetic ruin, was led past me. As he passed, he looked at me one last time, his eyes filled with the terrible final understanding of how completely he had been outmaneuvered. "You were right about one thing, Daniel. I said, my voice low, for his ears only. It was time for a change in leadership. You just misunderstood who was being replaced. He flinched as if I had struck him. Then he was gone, the doors of the boardroom closing behind him, leaving a stunned, silent audience in his wake. I looked at the shell-shocked faces of my board of directors. The confusion, the shock, it was all there. But underneath it, I saw something else beginning to dawn in their eyes, a profound, and perhaps a little fearful, respect. The dinosaur, they now understood, still had teeth. I gave them my most charming, disarming, and utterly confident smile. "Well," I said, my voice bright and full of energy. "That was an unexpected but necessary piece of housekeeping. Now I believe we have a 5-year strategic plan to discuss, if you'll all turn to page 1. And as the board members scrambled to open their folders, a new sense of order, my order, settled over the room. I had been tested. I had been betrayed, but I had not broken. I had merely reminded them all of the first, and most important, rule of the jungle. You never ever underestimate the predator who has survived the longest. My company was safe. My legacy was secure, and my reign was just beginning.